Please join me now in giving a very London welcome to Tom Michie.
Thanks, Jasmine, and thanks to all of you for turning out on a rainy morning. It's very nice to be here. It's slightly daunting to be the first speaker in a course, but as I said to Jasmine, it's a huge relief to precede and not to follow Kurt Di Camillo, who is a born raconteur and will be a kind of barnstorming speaker. So mine is perhaps a slightly more complicated brief, and that was to introduce the City of London before 1800. Well, there's quite a lot of time there to cover. And I've made the executive decision to finesse Roman Britain, medieval Britain, Tudor Britain, because although this may be the longest lecture I've ever been asked to give at 90 minutes, still that didn't seem enough time. So what I'm really going to do is focus since the Great Fire of London, the end of the 17th century, which races us headlong into the 18th century as a prelude to Kurt's talk on the 19th century, and then Edward Saywell on the 20th. Here I begin the sort of splash slide here of London, a view by Wenceslas Hollar of London in 1647. And really, by 1700, London was already the largest city in Europe, and by 1800, it was the largest in the world. So that gives you some idea of the galloping pace of change. And here, I apologize, it's a slightly blurry slide, but it gives you the idea of the trajectory of London's population. By mid-18th century, London had a population of 675,000 people, under 1 million, but still 10 times as large as the next largest city. London, as we know, really becomes this center of world commerce and production, but even in the 18th century, it was home to 360 different trade groups. It was the center of fashion, although I suppose Parisians would debate that, of luxury production and consumption, certainly in Britain, and rivaling Paris. Most important, though, why this great mushrooming of opportunity, it really became a magnet for European migration because they could make a better living. There was a rising population, of rising buying power, and so it became the place to be for talented people from all over Europe. Here I show you a map from 1761 showing the city limits, which you may be able to make out. I think it often helps in these situations to recognize the Tower of London. My little red spot isn't showing very clearly, but for those of you who visited, here is the Tower of London. That octagon or hexagon in the middle of the plan. And essentially what we're looking at is Green Park at the western edge, Oxford Street at the north, and Whitechapel at the eastern edge. And throughout the talk, I have also made the assumption that most of you have a traveler, at least a traveler's familiarity with London. Some may have greater expertise than mine in the history of the city, but I will throw around place names with the hope that some of these are familiar to you. The point in showing this to you, though, is off to the left. We haven't even quite made it to Hyde Park, and yet that is the city limit. Oxford Street, the great shopping street to the north, that was essentially the boundary of civilized London. Well, not quite civilized, but beyond that was essentially prairie lands of fields and meadows and woods. So in all, even in the mid-18th century, it was about 5 miles wide and about 2.5 miles from north to south. not very large. If I'd shown you a map of 100 years before, it wouldn't have been very different. So London's area and population had not exploded in the 17th century. It really happens in the 18th century. As you can see, it, of course, follows the Thames itself, as it had since Roman times, and that was a natural thing. We'll also see in terms of civic development how it begins at the river's edge and then moves gradually inland. Of course, all this comes to a screeching halt, whatever development there had been, in the City of London by the Great Fire of 1666. Some of you may be familiar with the monument, which I'm showing you on the right, which Christopher Wren erects in 1671. It commemorates the spot where the fire began in a bakery. It had been a hot, dry summer. The fire begins in a bakery. It spreads over the course of 3 days. It starts on Sunday, and actually we're coming up on the 350th anniversary of that fire. To give you some idea of the catastrophic nature of this, it destroyed 13,000 homes, 87 churches, 52 livery company halls and all that they contained, hospitals, schools, libraries, and blocks of buildings on 400 streets. It left 100,000 people homeless, many of those people who move south of the river or north and out of the city. But that is an amazing displacement of people and a kind of literally scorched earth result of the fire. Here shown in a 17th century painting on the right, and there the monument, which would have been a very familiar landmark until the 21st century, I suppose, when it's dwarfed by buildings around. It is often said that it was, if there was any blessing in the fire, it brought to the end, or followed on the heels of, a great plague of the year before. So certainly Londoners must have felt like Job on the dung heap. First it was plague, then it was fire, and it, I'm sure, was a profound tragedy all around. On the base of that column is a wonderful allegorical tablet by Caius Gabriel Cibber, showing on the left, if you can just make it out, maybe not, there's a group, there's a seated woman, her head hung, bowed but not bloodied, I suppose, and that is the city in ruins. And above, in lower relief, is fire and smoke and all kinds of figures in distress. The group standing on the right is Charles II, who, quite appropriately as a monarch, is directing science, architecture, and liberty towards the ruined city, backed up by justice and fortitude. So he has all the virtues on his side, and then workmen are scrambling on scaffolding to occupy the right half. So of course it is the nature of any society to rebuild. This had the royal support, although, as often happened, the royal support, but not necessarily the treasurer's support. Here is a map of the City of London showing, as you may read in the legend, the extent of the dreadful conflagration. What it's showing is essentially the City of London. Properly speaking, London, as we know it today, is really divided in half. In a way, it's two cities. The City of London, which was all about commerce, and the City of Westminster at the west, which is really about government. The two meet at Temple Bar, and to the east, it's generally Fleet Street, and to the left, it's the Strand, or to the west, the Strand, if you know those that great east-west thoroughfare. This is showing you really the scorched earth, which is what was left after the fire. Smoldering remains were extinguished. the Great Fire was not very different from the Second Great Fire of December 29th in 1940 as part of the Battle of Britain. Here's St. Paul's in the city looking to the northwest, and it was during that Christmas week that the German Luftwaffe dropped hundreds of incendiary and high explosive bombs that caused a firestorm that swept through the city. It is grim when you see this, and of course St. Paul's was a beacon of hope, miraculously not destroyed, although not spared from bombs itself. But still, the damage that we're looking at here was only about a third of what the Great Fire of 1666 had destroyed, to give you to some extent, an idea of its extent. Sorry. There was no shortage of plans, of course, when a city is destroyed for whatever reason, friend or foe, or it is the chance to rebuild and to rethink what the city would be. John Evelyn, a man who held important public positions under Charles II, he'd traveled widely. He envisioned, naturally, I think for the age, of remaking London as an Italian city with piazzas and boulevards. That's Evelyn's scheme at the top. Down below is Christopher Wren, who also sought to replace, finally, the narrow warrens of medieval streets with broad avenues radiating from central hubs, just as they would have known, say, in Paris or in Rome. Then, as now, land ownership issues, private property rights, and a lack of money overall meant that most of the buildings were finally rebuilt on their sites. Perhaps the most lasting code change was that a building should no longer be made of wood, that everything should be of brick or of stone, and that was a huge improvement. Of course, it takes away a lot of what was picturesque, but it does, it was thought, prevent the spread of fire like that before. These are grandiose plans, all of them pie in the sky, as you could see. And to imagine these kind of radial plans, you have to think of what would have gone even if it hadn't burned. But it's interesting to see that London had this opportunity and then sheer practicalities intervened and none of it happened. There was, however, parliamentary funds voted to rebuild churches at public expense. And I quite appropriately here's Wren's St. Pauls Cathedral, begun right after the fire and taking a decade or more to finish, finally completed around 1710. And then just because lectures abhor a vacuum, I've put 4 of the 12 churches around it, which were mostly designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor, who was Wren's colleague and sometimes competitors. And these were funded by a tax on coal. And coal, of course, was coming in. It was there was no evading that tax. And I think it also shows you they're all made of Portland stone. They tend to have a kind of Baroque flair of tall and narrow. And I think also if you consider churches built in the 1720s in the American colonies, they will often have the same formula of a narrow body, a tall spire at the front without a porch sometimes, and that is essentially the Baroque formula of Christopher Wren. So I'm just going to go back. If you look around St. Paul's, if you can see, what's sticking up all over the place are these spiky spires of some of the Wren churches, generically known as Queen Anne's churches, and built at public expense. The act voted by Parliament was for 50. In the end, 12 were built. Sounds familiar. One of the churches rebuilt has a direct connection to the MFA. This is St. Stephen's, Walbrook, begun by Christopher Wren in 1672. It didn't hurt that it was Wren's own parish church. And behind it, confounding photographers now and forever, is the new building of the Rothschild Bank behind it. So no more spire against blue skies, but a great church that has survived in its original setting. On the left is the interior, one of Wren's, really one of his great masterpieces. But by 1766, the east window, 76, the east window was covered by a large painting by Benjamin West, which you see on the right in our Conservation in Action studios. This is a painting after considerable turmoil, both at the parish level and at the national level, finally came to Boston and will be installed in our galleries this fall. Conservation we think, will be finished around September, and we're hoping to install it in the Evans Wing in October. But you can see there that it really, to the horror of some, and I suppose the delight of the rector at the time, covered up Wren's window at the east end there in the distance. There were other churches. This is, again, a church with an MFA connection because the silver two-handled cup was presented to Henry Flitcroft, the architect, in 1733 by the church's trustees. The citation, which is there on the oval dedicatory plaque in the middle, talks about his integrity and trustworthiness and so forth. Seems to have been a happy ending to a client and architect's commission. This is St. Giles in the Fields and was one of the program of the 50 New Churches Act that was built in the first quarter of the 18th century. Flitcroft had succeeded William Kent, a man we'll be talking about at several points in this talk today, in the Office of the Works. And the list of, if you just scan the list of others who'd come after him or with him around the same time as, of superintendents and controllers, you see the names Wren, Tallman, Vanbrugh, Kent, Flitcroft. These are the leading architects of the 18th century, and in fact the rebuilding of London and improvements to London in the first half of the 18th century were in very good hands. So this is the Silver Cup. There's a church which was very much inspired, I would say, by this church, perhaps the most familiar parish church in London. This is St. Martin in the Fields, a church built in 1722 to 26, and the architect was James Gibbs. It is the ultimate formula of a Baroque tower, but a classical porch there. It's not that common in London churches to have a freestanding portico like that, and it really was the prototype for churches. It was hugely influential, I would say, on churches in the American colonies. Gibbs was a remarkable man who had left a huge mark on building of London, although I think he's really someone who spanned the ages of the Baroque style of Christopher Wren, and by the time he died, really, the neoclassical style was much more fashionable. So I wouldn't say that Gibbs had a great impact on the direction of future architecture, but he did have an impact and a lasting legacy in the nature of pattern books that he published, which become style guides and idea sources for many different architects, both in Britain and especially in its colonies. There were other efforts in the mid-18th century to improve London, and the Mansion House was one. This is the Mansion House, not the generic Mansion House, but the Mansion House, which was alluded to in the title of this talk. It was, and is the official residence of London's Lord Mayor. It's designed in the Palladian style by George Dance. And what I've mentioned neoclassical, now I'm mentioning Palladian. It is, in fact, all under the big umbrella of classical revival styles. When we think of those plans of the 1670s to rebuild London in the image of Rome, there were many grand tour enthusiasts who come back starry-eyed with ideas of classical Rome. And I suppose for a big chunk of the population and of patrons, Italian-inspired classical design becomes the bedrock of stability, not just good taste. It actually becomes linked in the political imagination with stability, which is to say it's setting up those dissenting styles and fashion victims of, say, the Rococo style, for example, as unstable and sometimes even reckless. But we'll see that. In other words, we often say you are what you wear. Decorative arts curators say you are what you sit on. This is perhaps tantamount to saying you are what you live in. However, John Summerson, a great architectural historian, wrote, and I can't help quoting, it's just fun, it says, the building leaves an impression of uneasily constricted bulk. It's all very tactful, but then at the end of the sentence goes on the whole, the building is a striking reminder that good taste was not a universal attribute in the 18th century. Wags at the time referred to that third story or fourth story. It looks like a boxcar at the top. It was an attic story, and it quickly got the nickname of Noah's Ark. And basically, the building was ridiculed, but it's still there, still holds functions of the Lord Mayor. And I mention it really as a kind of monument of civic grandeur that London in the 18th century was marked by across the way. These are all in the city of London towards the east. This is a fascinating view at the city of Westminster along the Thames. This is a painting by Canaletto, which shows what remains of the Whitehall Palace, its privy garden in the foreground, and then the Holbein Gate, that's the Tudor building off to the left, which spans what today is Whitehall, the road going up to, basically from the Houses of Parliament to Trafalgar Square. Why is there all that empty space? Well, in fact, it had been thoroughly colonized by Whitehall Palace, which had been the main residence of English monarchs from 1530 until 1698, when again, a great fire swept away most of that palace, except for the end. We're looking here at the sort of backside of the Banqueting House, which had been built to the designs of Inigo Jones. Here, just to show you the extent of that sprawling palace, is a plan of Whitehall Palace before the fire of 1698. Then it was one of the largest palaces in Europe, and this is mostly thanks to the expansions by Henry VIII, who included, Henry was a great athlete, and there were many open spaces for diversions, like a tilting ground for jousting and so forth. This is the banquet house in Henry VIII's time, which was then rebuilt in the 1620s in the Baroque style. You'll note here, those of you who can read, things like Scotland Yard. Here is what today is Whitehall, and the Houses of Parliament would be just to the left in this view. So Whitehall, an enormous palace and an important palace, but then nothing but empty yards and two buildings left. In that view, sorry, I didn't mean to go back. Here's the Banqueting House, which was the scene of the execution of Charles I, and then really not used after that. But with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, so a generation later, the Banqueting House was returned to its former glory as the great ceremonial chamber of the royal court under Charles II. James II, the last, almost last of the Stuarts, was the last monarch to live at Whitehall Palace. After that, it was either build a new one or adapt older ones, as we shall see. I thought it was helpful here just to remind us that Whitehall is at the right of this plan, and just here, sorry, not a very robust pointer, but here you can see the Horse Guards, which is there today. Here, that jumbled pile is St. James Palace. Here's the Mall, here's Pall Mall, and there's what today is Buckingham Palace. St. James Park with the Serpentine Pond in the center, and then Green Park, of course, and Hyde Park beyond. I show this just to remind us that the Palace of Westminster, the Palace of Whitehall, St. James Palace, and eventually what would become Buckingham Palace are all within, I'd say, less than a mile of one another. That's a lot of palaces, and you have your choice if you're the monarch. We'll come back to this map on a few occasions because I think it's, although almost cartoon-like, it's very helpful to give you the relationship of these buildings. Here is St. James Palace. We all know the terms from the court of St. James. Before 2 summers ago, I'd never really been around St. James Palace, and it's not really open to the public. It is the senior palace of the sovereign, and it's still the court to which ambassadors and high commissioners are accredited. It was built in the 1530s by Henry VIII, and it was still the home, it's the official home of the monarch until Victoria, who lives at Buckingham Palace. Queen Anne brings her court to St. James in 1702 after the fire that destroyed Whitehall, and it remains the official residence. And I think George IV decides, no way is he going to live there. George III already was rather scornful of it, but the Hanovers never built great palaces, as we will see. Foreign visitors were consistently underwhelmed by the palace, and they mention this because this is where ambassadors are received, and they found it small, asymmetrical, and brick. Not the stuff of palaces. As early as 1728, a French visitor advised, and actually it's very sound advice, says, quote, "One must here disengage from the idea of Versailles and the grand palaces of kings." Although I think it's fair to say that with the arrival of William III, as you remember, he's invited to take the throne. And after the Glorious Revolution, kings are not there by divine right. They're there with the blessing of Parliament. And it's Parliament who oversees the royal income. So it was never politically feasible after William III, and essentially for the Hanoverian kings, to erect grand palaces. It just wasn't in the cards. So they tended to renovate rooms in old palaces. So in fact, the approach to St. James, lofty name with great associations, but it is still a warren, practically medieval, and in brick. The Queen's Library, and that is Queen Caroline, George II's queen, built a fantastic library there, designed by William Kent in 1737. It was perhaps the most significant addition by the early Georgians, but sadly destroyed by fire in 1809 with most of the royal apartments at St. James. They've been renovated over the years, and now what you see is mostly Victorian and Edwardian additions. George III referred to it as that dust trap, and there are famous stories of ladies in waiting who just completely missed appointments because they were lost. So it is, that's when picturesque becomes annoying, I suppose. But there are grand spaces today. There's still a presence room, and in fact, even a fantastic room I'd never known about that William Morris decorated with tapestries and so forth. So it's a fascinating place. The Chapel Royal is still there, certainly not open to the public, but it's not perhaps part of our royal mythology except in name, because no one ever goes there. But it was very important after Whitehall burns to the ground. It is essentially, I think, Kensington Palace which plays the greatest role in the first half of the 18th century. William and Mary, I think, fled the city. It wasn't that urban, but still he was said to be asthmatic or preferred the fresh air in the country, left the city of Westminster, going, after all, only about a mile or two into the country to Kensington Palace, which I show you here. It was also then the principal residence of George I and II, although they remain at St. James officially. Here is the main building that William and Mary occupied. And we'll see here this roof, hipped roof. Here's a great cupola room, which William Kent, I'll show you in a minute, added for George I. This I didn't bring images of, but Queen Anne builds this as a gallery, and it's full of blue and white porcelain. It must have been quite fantastic. This is the long gallery, here. Today, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are renovating that. It's all under scaffolding, so that's where William and Kate will live, for example. That's also where Diana still had apartments. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are getting Princess Margaret's former quarters. The Kents are here. The Duke of Gloucester was here. It is essentially the home of modern royals. They're in the Georgian wings, but our concern really is that lower right part, which William and Mary built. Here is the man I keep referring to on the left, William Kent, painted in the 1720s. He was a man of many talents. He was an architect, he designed furniture, he was a landscape designer, he was a painter and muralist, and on the right is his essential patron, Richard Boyle, the third Earl of Burlington. He'd met Kent in Italy, brought him back to London, puts him up in style at Somerset House, and basically uses Kent as his right-hand man to execute buildings in the Italian or Palladian style, which he had grown to love over the course of 3 grand tours, all in the 17 teens. So it was thanks to Burlington that Kent was had official positions. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Sorry, I'm not finding that. But as a surveyor and controller of the works and so forth, so able to execute the king's bidding, but also working for private clients. I hope that little square will go off shortly. Oh dear, who knows what that will follow. Oops, so sorry. Okay. Rick, I am getting a message which is obscuring all the lecture notes and slides. So in the interest of a lecture, I will, thank you, that's just fine. Great, sorry about that. Thank you, Rick. William Kent was certainly in the service of George I, George II, also of Lord Burlington, and creates some of the great interiors of the time we're going to show. Here's Burlington's greatest creation. He built many more buildings, but this is the most intact survivor of Lord Burlington's Palladian ideal. This is Chyzyk House to the west of London, built in 1729. It is essentially a Palladian temple, and as you see, the plan is fantastic, a pure symmetry. It is an interesting space to pass through. This is now open to the public, and I recommend you go. It's an easy tube ride outside of London. So to show you the kind of purity of classical taste, which was the kind of academic touchstone of this style, here's William Kent in a staircase for the king at Kensington Palace. It's commissioned by George I in 1724, And it's an amazing kind of creation, because this, as you ascend the stairs, it's the household staff peering over the balustrade, watching you come up, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek creation, but actually very lifelike and full of life. This is entirely Kent's creation, and as an even better joke, in one of the panels above, one of these lunettes there in the dome, is a self-portrait of Kent with his little hat and palette overlooking you in a kind of perspectival trick here to fool the eye. So it's an amazing space, animated by the murals of William Kent, but architecturally it's really this room, and I showed you that hip roof behind the King's Gallery in the brick, the earlier block. This is the so-called cupola room by Kent, and you can see its coffered ceiling painted in bright gold and blue, and in the middle of it, an extraordinary musical clock that was created by the court sculptor for the Princess of Wales, actually George II's daughter-in-law, married to Frederick, Prince of Wales. There are dials with allegorical scenes. There's a bronze group of Atlas on the top and the four corners of the monarchies of the world, and dials representing these ancient monarchies of Assyria and Persia, Greece, and Rome. The clock performs with an organ, a musical interlude. It's one of those tour de forces of mechanical genius in the middle of one of the great spaces with chandeliers, painted decoration, bright white marble, coffered spaces. This really is the Hanoverian king stepping out on a scale that is as grand as anything that the Stuarts had provided, say, at Whitehall in the Banqueting House that survives. So this is really kind of the monarch's grandeur, which was a successful design by William Kent. Today, Kensington Palace is run by Historic Royal Palaces, and it's not exactly a museum. It's part collection, part theme park, and it's a curious place, heavy on interpretation, and you're whizzed through these royal rooms of the Georgians to get to Victoria, who was born there, as quickly as possible. But it does, if you haven't been, it's definitely worth a visit, because you can see all these rooms, and they're fantastic layers of royal patronage from William III to the Hanoverians and beyond. I mention George II as a patron because we again have not architectural connections, but a direct connection with one of our great silver candelabras designed by William Kent for George II. In fact, to be fair, it wasn't for an English palace. It was for their twin parallel life in Hanover. These were for Herrenhausen, but we have one of 5 chandeliers, and upstairs today in the Coke Gallery, you'll see 2 of 12 candelabra, also designed by William Kent for George III and delivered in 1737. The connection to England is kind of gossamer thin because they were stored briefly at Windsor during the Napoleonic Wars, lest Napoleon grab them from Hanover. And there along the window wall, you can see the Hanoverian silver furniture, plus William III's silver furniture, and it must have been an amazing season when these were all gathered for safekeeping at Windsor. After the Napoleonic Wars, they went shooting back to Hanover because those royal assets were never commingled, England and Hanover. They were different countries. Although he was the elector of one and king of the other, they had separate accounts, separate palaces, but a kind of twin life. So this is showing Hanover chandeliers installed at Windsor. The Hanoverians really are a separate lecture, I suppose, and what I describe as parallel tracks is quite fascinating. I don't think the Georges get enough credit for running 2 kingdoms, and perhaps often are the butt of jokes in Great Britain, but in fact managed, I think, to manage both of those kingdoms quite well. Here we're back to our fun map because I wanted to remind us that George III, I've already told you he thought St. James was a dust trap, and basically took steps to move to Buckingham House, which he purchased in 1710. It had been built here, showing you as it was a townhouse for the Duke of Buckingham, but the king bought it in 1761 as a retreat for Queen Charlotte, and it was then known as the Queen's House. So not just a stone's throw from St. James, but this was already a kind of retreat. The core of the house is really long gone, but it is embedded, I should say engulfed, by what became Buckingham Palace. It's the portico there at the back of the palace, embedded in the staterooms, which was expanded first by George IV, later by William IV, and then ultimately by Victoria and finished in 1913. So I'm assuming that Kurt de Camillo will go on about the evolution of Buckingham Palace, which is fascinating. I think the Queen, if George III called St. James the dustbin, the Queen refers to Buckingham Palace basically as the office. And yet it began as a rural retreat, and there's still a trace of that. Foreign visitors who were scathing about St. James, I struggled to think how to represent the underbelly of London in the 18th century, because foreigners were often struck by the kind of tavern life, which was rich, as you see it here. This is perhaps closer to the truth than any of the refined things I'm going to show you. It's a gentleman's company, presumably at a tavern, not exactly in full command of their senses, a punch bowl on the table, broken bottles below, and doing all kinds of depraved things. After a print, The Midnight Modern Conversation, which became a hugely popular print by Hogarth. So taverns, it's hard to represent taverns with slides or digital images, but you have to take my word that they were everywhere, as were coffee houses. The other aspect of life in London, which either attracted or repelled visitors, was the extent of prostitution. Everywhere. Even, Frenchmen said, my God, they're everywhere. You just can't go anywhere in public without being solicited. There was no prostitute more refined, or should I say more costly, than Kitty Fisher, who sat here for a portrait by Nathaniel Hone, which you can find at the National Portrait Gallery, and she will be one of the stars of the Casanova exhibition that Jasmine mentioned. Casanova, it should be said, was all about libertinism, but couldn't hit it off with Kitty Fisher because he didn't speak English, she didn't speak Italian or French, and Casanova, lover of life that he was, and of women, basically was a non-starter if he couldn't communicate. So he had an opportunity to meet Kitty Fisher, but basically said, thanks, but no thanks. It's not to his taste because they couldn't communicate. It's a wonderful pun, which you may have picked up looking at this, because on the right, there is Kitty fishing for a goldfish in the bowl, hence Kitty Fisher. So I'm not going to talk about the kind of infrastructure of prostitution, but there were bagnios, there were bordellos. There was a huge industry, and we see it as something quite horrid, but I think it was very much a part of life, certainly a huge part of a young woman's options coming to London, and certainly for poor young women, of which there were thousands in London. I also wanted to take this lecture to paint a picture, as it were, of artistic culture in London, because it's in the 18th century, the mid-18th century, when fledgling organizations take shape, all of them in quest of a public or a national posture for art and artists. No one was more vociferous than William Hogarth, whose self-portrait with his pug on the left. You can see that at Tate Britain from 1745. And where he would hold court, essentially, was a coffee house. On the right, it's the middle building, known as Old Slaughters, if you can read the legend on the cornice there, in St. Martin's Lane. St. Martin's Lane is still there. It's where many theaters are. St. Martin's in the Fields is at the lower end of it, and it runs from north to south, from Trafalgar Square. There were many coffee houses there. And coffee houses weren't that different perhaps than Starbucks has come to be today. They were meeting places, and people would hang out. It was a cut above taverns. I think alcohol was served, but not abundantly, and it wasn't about drowning your sorrows. It was more about socializing. Coffee houses, of which by 1740, there were 550 coffee houses across London. They tended to be the gathering spots for special interests. So the artistic coffee house was Slaughters, as we're showing here. There, for almost every trade or profession or hobby or interest, there was a kind of generally accepted but not legislated crowd that would form. Artists were coming to London, as I mentioned at the very outset, but these are German, Italian, French craftsmen all coming to London, and certainly most prominent among them, I suppose, in art circles were the French, led by Huguenots, and really what we're talking about are second-generation French craftsmen. This is where Hogarth set up something called St. Martin's Lane Academy. St. Martin's is the street running north-south there on the right. This is just off. It's Peter's Lane, and around the red circle I've put there is where St. Martin's Academy formed. It was essentially a drawing instruction place, although it was also a place for conversation and meeting. Painters belonged, architects belonged, sculptors, and engravers. And these were what I mentioned as the kind of preludes to a national academy or a royal academy. And here I'm jumping way ahead. This is a bit anachronistic. This is a view by John Zoffany, himself a German, who's showing the academicians at the Royal Academy in 1770. So it has formed, it has a home, and here they're setting up for life drawing. The Royal Academy in London wasn't established until 1768, but it had grown out of all these upstarts of the 1730s. And I think that's a very important kind of loose federation of these groups, all with different passions. They rise and fall according to their de facto leaders' passions and abilities. And it does pose the question of why was there no national or royal academy before that? And England was unusual in that sense. Yes, the monarch was a patron, usually for private purposes, not always for national purposes. So this was different in France and Italy, and England had, I suppose, was operating at a certain disadvantage there. The first president of the Royal Academy is Sir Joshua Reynolds, and in this view, he is here in black with his famous trademark ear trumpet listening. Also, if you look closely, or if you've seen the painting, you'll see that there is it almost is like Starbucks. There's a counter there, crowded out here in this view, but that is where artists would sit and have their sketch pads there at the counter for the model posing from life. So here it looks fairly rudimentary in its space, but this is an important milestone of artistic culture in London. Here is where it finally found a home, and what a home it was. This is Somerset House. The interior court of Somerset House, conceived and built by Sir William Chambers, begun in 1775. It is vast. If it looks vast in this, imagine two more sides behind you. I've often wondered why this isn't a more famous building, because surely it must have been one of the modern wonders of the world when it was built, for size alone. And I've wondered if it wasn't because it held public offices. It was all the kind of cabinet-level administrative departments that were here, which aren't all that interesting unless you have business with them. But as a public space, yes, but why not as an architectural marvel, which it was? Behind us in this view is the front along the Strand, which held the Royal Academy, the Royal Society, and the Society of Antiquaries. This is the river side, which again was a remarkable thing, built right at the Thames. And I put in this slide because, again, there's a Boston connection, that Charles Bulfinch was on a grand tour in Europe between 1785 and 87. And surely Somerset House was the most important public building of its time that anyone could have seen in London 10 years later. And I think the Massachusetts State House, which he begins 10 years after that, 1795 or so, is clearly based on the central pavilion of Somerset House. This is the Strand facade. This is where the Royal Academy was. And here was the goal. This is what had been lacking until 1768, was an exhibition room of the annual show of contemporary art. We take for granted the public display of art, but in London there were no public displays of art, no place where you could go to find what was current and fashionable. So here's a Rowlandson caricature of that room at Somerset House with a annual painting show. Song gives, by definition, the salon hang of those paintings. If that was the place to go and see art that was modern, the 18th century was also the birth of art that was historical. And I show this as the British Museum, its first home. The museum was established in 1753, largely, as many of you know, based on the collections of a physician and a scientist named Hans Sloane. It opens to the public in 1759, and this is where it opened, in Montague House, which is on the site of the present British Museum in Bloomsbury. The Duke of Montague had abandoned the house. It's hard to imagine Bloomsbury going out of fashion, but it became kind of down at the heels, and he moved to fashionable Whitehall, and so the house was sold to the trustees of the British Museum. This house was the British Museum until the 1840s, when it was torn down to create the present building. I mentioned the expanding wealth and population, and also London as a magnet for European craftsmen. It's very unusual to have portraits of craftsmen. And this on the left is Nicolas Primo, who was born in Liège, comes to London in the 1740s as a silversmith, trained as a silversmith, and trained silversmiths himself. But it's a fantastic story because he essentially puts down his silversmith's tools to found a porcelain manufactory, England's first porcelain manufactory, the Chelsea Works, around 1745. So in the upper right is a silver sauceboat in our collection that Sprimont designed, and then the really curious goat and bee pitcher. It's hard to think of that as a beautiful design. It is quite a bizarre combination of goats and plants and flowers, and there is a bee there somewhere as a cream pitcher. But this is some of the first porcelain produced in England in the 1740s and designed by Primo. It's not surprising that some of his first porcelain was in the shape of silver, which he had made. There is no more famous or eccentric silver than this centerpiece on the top, and then these salts made of crayfish and shells, commissioned by Frederick, Prince of Wales, the son of George II. The centerpiece is probably by Sprimont, and it's from the so-called Marine Service that Frederick acquired in the 1740s. According to Sprimont's widow, he had superior skill and taste in the arts of drawing, modeling, and painting. What's interesting is that no royal accounts exist. I should say no accounts are in the royal household accounts that document the payment by the Prince of Wales for this. And it could have been because his gentleman of the bedchamber, Charles Calvert, 5th Earl of Baltimore, just paid the bills and took care of that for the Prince of Wales. There are bills from 43 and 44 to Primo and Paul Crespin. Calvert, as some of you may sense where this is coming or leading, was the same Calverts of Baltimore, and he was Lord Proprietor of Maryland. We, because I'm always stretching to find MFA connections, we have a direct connection between Calvert because a room from his country house, Woodcote Park, is in the MFA's collection. This room, not installed, waiting in the wings for future installation, was one of those extraordinary creations in the 1750s in the French Rococo style. Frederick, Prince of Wales, is often said to have been the great champion of the French Rococo style, and that was, as I alluded to before, the lunatic fringe basically battling with the monolith of classical stability. Frederick himself probably was on the edges of good graces with his father at all times, and this is certainly one of those interiors built by one of the men in Frederick's circle, and that's an important moment for artistic circles in the 1750s. The perennial tension between the Prince of Wales and the king, it's amazing. There wasn't a Hanoverian king who got along with his firstborn son. It was almost congenital that they were on the outs. And Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died at the age of 40, was no exception. So just as George II had been estranged from his father, Frederick was with his father. He was left in Hanover until the age of 21 when he was summoned to London and immediately really banished from St. James Palace and sets up something of a rival court. It's quite fascinating. But this is where he lived. If you've booked tickets for films in London, it was probably at Leicester Square, and the house at the top, the north end there of Leicester Square, is where Frederick, Prince of Wales, lived. So in fact, this tension between the monarch and the heir had civic implications, and as we'll see, Frederick moved about. He dies, and it's his son, George III, actually George II's grandson, who becomes king. Here was a moment, because I've mentioned this kind of nativist strain, there was the undercurrent of good taste, of classicism, but there was also a kind of nativist fervor of anti-French design. This is the Anti-Gallican Society, and the man who engraved this frontispiece has really nothing to do with that. This is Thomas Johnson, a fantastic pattern book of new designs for carvers. He puts the Anti-Gallican emblem as the frontispiece to his book. And you can see at the top, that's Britannia, who's actually setting fire to French wallpaper or papier-mâché. So French products are being torched, and there at the lower left is lurking France with this fleur-de-lis fabric in the form of envy. That's the personification of envy with his dreadlocks. So this is France vanquished and cowering under Britannia. And it was really, it's an interesting double standard because I think the British have always had a love-hate relationship with France. They hated the kind of cultural supremacy, but they loved its products, and it's hard to reconcile that. The French, of course, were everywhere, from silversmiths to actors to chefs, engravers, hairdressers, dancing masters, carvers, engravers, painters, and so forth. Here is another of these wonderful kind of caricatures. This is the English nightmare of French cultural imperialism. It's poking fun at everything, and especially casks of champagne, Burgundy, and claret, and you can see a chef making a deal. These are merchants on the dock. There you can see the tower in the background, and so it is this the imports of Great Britain from France humbly addressed to the laudable associations of anti-Gallicans and the generous promoters of British arts and manufactures, another splinter group that was promoting British goods. I thought we should return back to some of the architectural or engineering marvels, and there's some things I think we take for granted when we go to England, such as bridges over the Thames. No longer surviving is this old London Bridge, shown here in a painting from 1632, first of wood, then later rebuilt in stone. But the point is the rickety buildings which were on top and only swept away later on. First comes to mind fire trap, and yes, it was a fire trap. So this is the kind of half-timbered building which was outlawed after 1666. But for the longest time, this was the only bridge from across the river into the city of London. The miraculous Westminster Bridge was authorized early on. There was lots of dithering about contracts and construction. It wasn't finished until 1750. It wasn't actually passable until 1750. Here's Canaletto painting it in 1747, but one of the arches failed and it was back to the drawing board and then finally opened in 1750. The point is it was constructed of stone. It carried pedestrians and vehicles, and it was only the second bridge to span the Thames. It was hailed as an engineering marvel, and people went on and on about one of the grandest bridges in the world and a monument of glory unequaled in all Europe. Those were London critics, as you can imagine. But actually visitors like Canaletto came to see it and painted all these new works. On a civic level, it also helped link London to the South Bank and therefore connected what was an expanding metropolis, which would become a great metropolis. At the Westminster end, this bridge now ends right by the Houses of Parliament. It also helped to clarify that mess of streets left over from Whitechapel and Westminster Palace. So it had civic benefits on the Westminster side and also across the river as well. This is Canaletto, I think, pining for Venice. He's trying to make the Thames look like the Bacino in Venice, and that's not the Doge's gondola, but it is the Lord Mayor's procession, an annual event when the Thames never looks so much like the Venetian lagoon. All the other swarms of boat are the English livery companies that I mentioned, and this is a fantastic portrait, but starring the bridge in 1750. Here is the royal barge of Frederick, Prince of Wales, designed by none other than William Kent. We're looking at the stern here at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. I think you can get an idea of the splendor of these things. Here, another view of Canaletto, fascinated by these public works, a view east, looking at the City of London through one of the arches under construction. So that's the scaffolding holding the masonry construction in place. And a rather exciting way to frame a view. Here is Somerset House from the water side, and I think you can see what an amazing structure it must have been in the mid-18th century. But actually the point of this slide is to look at the Victoria Embankment, which was a roadway that gained considerable waterfront land in front of it. However, it left Somerset House high and dry, cut off from the river. The big benefit, I suppose, is it allowed space for the district line of the London Underground, plus the roadway above. The slide in the upper right, though, is to remind us that Chambers, William Chambers, had intended an inspiring river frontage, and in the center was the arch for the king's barge master, and it must have been quite a sight to see a barge like the one I just showed you disappear into or emerge from one of these entries at high water. So they are now landlocked, but still a commanding view of the river. And just to give you a sense of how challenging it was to build along the river. It's about 40 feet from the level of the Strand down to the bank of the Thames. So to build anything there requires huge abutments and bracing of the land. The other big project, 1768, is by the Adam brothers, Robert, James, and William, Scottish architects who come to London, who designed this building called Adelphi Terrace. It was a speculative venture. Warehouses below, along the river, like Somerset House, and then 40 unified residences above. It brought them to the brink of ruin. It didn't help that the warehouses often flooded, as you might imagine, and votes of Parliament to create funds. The city was rather invested in this, but eventually it did become a success and did become a fashionable address for the rest of the century. Above is the elevation showing you the size and scale of this. These are remarkable things, and I would say were notable by any measure internationally of architectural ambition. So this is London in the 1760s and 70s. Very important, back to the underbelly in a way, although it had a polite veneer, of sort of gardens and pleasure grounds. This was the lower brow of the two. This is Vauxhall Gardens on the south banks of the Thames, in Vauxhall today. It had opened in the 1660s, and it finally closed in 1859, so it really ran for about 200 years. It was acres of garden paths, the site of musical performances and light suppers. Actually, in a Smollett picaresque novel, Lydia Melford in the Expedition of Humphrey Clinker talks about striking objects, pavilions, lodges, groves, grottos, lawns, temples, cascades, porticos, colonnades, rotundos, all adorned with pillars, statues, paintings, illuminations, and you get the picture. This was a kind of amusement park by day and by night. I love the fact that it's street front. You entered here. It looks like just a doorway, and then you pass through into this magical 12 or 13 acres of manicured gardens and paths. Here's Canaletto again, painting the Grand Walk at Vauxhall in 1751, showing the three main structures, all exotic, a Turkish tent, one for organ and orchestra. So music was a very important part of this. So was art. We mentioned St. Martin's Lane Academy. Vauxhall was like the open gallery for contemporary work. One of the first life-size marble statues, this one of George Frederick Handel by Roubiliac, stood there to the right of the orchestra temple, where I've put a red circle. There were 50 supper boxes along the edges, and those all had paintings by Francis Hayman, and I'm just showing you one there. It may be that Jonathan Tyers, the impresario, was going to dress it up with paintings and sculpture and make it respectable, because I think it was pretty commonly known that, again, prostitutes and rakes had sort of invaded Vauxhall because it was famous for its secluded garden paths, which in a gallant age were places for polite retreat, but in a less polite world were not so conducive to polite company. So it was, I think, a veneer of respectability. If Vauxhall was the salon of St. Martin's Lane, the Foundling Hospital in Bloomsbury was really its museum. This becomes, it still has a permanent collection. Hogarth and Handel were both instrumental and early supporters, both giving works of art, and the Foundling Hospital has moved out today, but the Coram Foundation collection is still there in Bloomsbury. These buildings long gone, but there it's an amazing collection of work by Hogarth, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Ricebrack, and so forth. Here are two of the early gifts, a portrait of Coram, the founding patron, a captain, by Hogarth on the left, and then the most beautiful marble relief of Charity by Michael Ricebrack, just to show you two of those works. The rival pleasure garden, and the more polite, which is to say more costly of the two, was called Ranelagh, which was just adjacent to the Chelsea Royal Hospital in the gardens of Ranelagh House. And it was operating since the 40s. The principal attraction was this big heated rotunda, 150 feet. In the middle was a fireplace to keep everyone warm, and the whole point of it was to go see people walking around. And it was called the Ring of Folly. So it was really to see and be seen. Closer to home were the parks extending from Whitehall to Kensington, so St. James Park, which we've seen, Green Park, Hyde Park. This is a temporary structure built for fireworks in 1749 in the middle of Green Park. Green Park had been laid out, like others, at the end of the 17th century as a royal park. And there's a famous quip where Queen Caroline asked Robert Walpole what it would cost. She liked it so much. And still today you'll see the Queen's Walk or Constitution Hill, where the king took his constitution. She wanted basically to wall it off for the king's personal use. She asked Walpole what it would cost, and he said, "Only a crown, madam," which she took the point and later embraced it and made wonderful improvements of her own. The fireworks display, where Handel's Royal Fireworks, music for Royal Fireworks, was played but not premiered. The rehearsal the night before attracted 12,000 people to Vauxhall to hear it, but the first firework went off, backfired, set the temple on fire, Horace Walpole says only 3 people were killed. It was really quite a well-behaved mob. So the fireworks continued nevertheless. I just mentioned here's the Mall in front of St. James Palace, and others said it was one of the most frequented walks in London, 1,000 paces long. Here, of course, is a very beautiful painting by Gainsborough, late painting of the Mall in St. James Park. And it was said that between 7 and 10 on a summer evening, it was so filled with society, you couldn't help touch your neighbor. So it's like the passeggiata, just to step out and see and be seen. Above St. James Palace and across the eastern edge of Green Park is the sole surviving house from the 18th century. This is Spencer House, one of the most ambitious private residences ever built. We have a direct connection again. Those chairs shown there in the niches are reproductions of chairs in the MFA's collection. This is the Palm Room, which was where gentlemen retired after dinner, designed by John Vardy. And here are designs for it, thought to be design by Inigo Jones, which meant it was in the Palladian tradition, but that was a mistake, actually, a kind of misunderstanding. Here are the chairs as it came into the museum, as it was later stripped. It's fascinating. These have been, I shouldn't say this with pride, but it is interesting. They've been in storage for 40 years because of their complicated surface. And suffice it to say, originally they had bright blue-green color of a ground with gilded highlights. And it's a long story, but we can't actually control the removal of higher layers because of distemper colors. So we can't get back to the original without destroying the original, but someday we will do it. Midstream, Earl Spencer fired John Vardy and hired James Athenian Stewart. He wanted a pure Grecian style, and here's the great room on the first floor in that style. This is open to the public. You can see it. There's some of the greatest interiors. And here is Athenian Stewart's masterpiece, the painted room, which is the climax, really, of the Piano Nobile, with painting one of the earliest neoclassical ensembles in Europe. Briefly, I'm just going to run through what we've lost and what we're missing. These are the city palaces. This is Northumberland House in the Strand, basically the lower end of Trafalgar Square. It stood from 1605 until 1874. There it is, that rather Tudor-looking square below Charing Cross. And here it is in 1874, just before it was torn down. Enormous palace. And basically being squeezed by Charing Cross and the Thames embankment. The Percy family grabbed the lead cast lion and put it on top of their country house, Syon House, before the house was torn down. Also, perhaps a better-known name, Devonshire House, built for William Cavendish. It looks like a fairly homely or perhaps severe house designed by William Kent in the 1730s. It was empty after the First World War, demolished in 1924, but not before all the salvage was removed, some of it just sold by the current Duke in 2010. And it was torn down for an apartment block. Here are the interiors, not much of William Kent left, but give you a sense of Edwardian grandeur of Devonshire House. Norfolk House in St. James Square was rebuilt in the 1740s, demolished in 1938. The interior, there it was on St. James Square, so just behind what was Carlton House and Carlton House Terrace. It had famous Rococo interiors. Here's one in 1937 before it was demolished. Here it is today as a period room at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Norfolk was a great champion of Frederick, Prince of Wales. He sheltered him when he was tossed out of St. James Palace. It was actually here that George III was born. And the building that replaced it was actually where Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander, just now a 1930s office block. But fortunately, the music room, really one of the greatest Rococo interiors in the 18th century, is preserved. Finally, Lansdowne House, the sort of tail end of our period in the 1760s, and was built right below Berkeley Square. As I show you, it was rather nice because here is Devonshire House at the lower right. The Lansdowne House was pulled back so as not to interrupt the view over the garden of their Cavendish neighbors. An enormous house, famous today for its interiors today at the Metropolitan by Robert Adam, also at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the drawing room. So these are great interiors that just happen to be preserved, but showing you these black and white, semi-dreary looking houses, you have to remember the real seats of power were country houses on vast estates, but there were the city, essentially palaces, although they weren't called that. They were the city townhouses, basically of noble landowners, most of which vanished in the 1920s and 30s. So, as a coda at the end, I remind you I was trying to wrap this up with a bow in 1800, but there is no great event that happens in 1800 that makes the speaker's task easy. So I'm showing you here just George III, who carried on until 1820, but as regent, George IV, or the Prince Regent, Prince of Wales, from 1810 or so, who I assume will figure prominently in Kurt T. Camillo's talk. Finally, just to show you where we started and where we've come, I didn't show a map of London in 1670 because it wasn't that different from London in 1770. But here, from 1760 to 1860, I think you can see just in a vague notion of the grayness of urban sprawl, how the city has mushroomed today in one of the largest cities in the world. But these are the topics for next week's lecture. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions. There's a microphone on either side of the aisle, and we do ask that those of you who are departing now, please do so quietly so that we can start with the Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hello. Am I first? Oh, I'm curious to know why tea houses instead of coffee houses were in hangouts, given how the British had tea trade and
yes.
the custom of tea at 4 in the afternoon.
It's a changing fashion and I suppose a function of global trade. Coffee starts as the intoxicating beverage, but it is gradually supplanted by tea thanks to the East India Company and those imports. So in fact, there are tea houses, and tea is certainly the drink of choice later on. In Hogarth's time, in the 1720s and 30s, I think it is more apt to be coffee. There are promotional pamphlets for the salubrious effects of both, and coffee then, as now, was known to be a kind of stimulant, and it may be that learned societies thought coffee was more appropriate. They were commercial centers as well as social centers, and a lot of this happens because of the vacuum, really, of royal patronage. It's a very different culture of the court than it is in other countries. But to your point specifically, yes, coffee was gradually supplanted by tea as the favorite beverage.
Has Vauxhall Gardens morphed into something else in current London?
I don't think Vauxhall has morphed into the booming. There are more cranes there now than ever before. But I don't think there's any trace left. The streets are there that led to it, but I don't think there's anything like 12 acres of garden paths left in Vauxhall. It is a ground zero for development on the south bank now. Someone may know more than I do about Vauxhall, but it is just across the river, but it is heavily developed now.
And our next question will be in the back.
There used to be a nursery rhyme, Lucy Locket lost her pocket, Kitty Fisher found it. Is this the Kitty Fisher?
I think it must be. I don't think any self-respecting woman would have called herself Kitty Fisher after the Kitty Fisher, who was a celebrated courtesan, shall we say. If I could just follow up on the last one, it is worth mentioning that Ranelagh in Chelsea, now when you go to Chelsea Royal Hospital, if you've ever been to the Grosvenor House Fair, you descend towards the river, and along the east side there now are gardens where Ranelagh was. So in fact, that open space is still very garden-like as Ranelagh was. So it is possible to get a sense of the scale of that. I'm pleased to say the National Portrait Gallery has agreed to lend us the portrait of Kitty Fisher, so you will see her in our Casanova exhibition.
Next question is in the back.
Thank you very much for that talk. And I know your talk is called Mansion House to Coffee House, but I'm just curious, how did the average person live at the times? Were there just like regular smaller houses around these mansion houses?
Yes, those mansion houses are what I've shown you were dukes and earls and barons. They were city palaces. Most people, I think, lived in rather modest circumstances, and the expanding population tended to move east. And different parishes become really the centers of different kinds of populations. So, for example, Spitalfields today, you still get a sense of 18th century townhouses and row houses of modest working people. It was I think there was a huge disparity between wealth and poverty. And again, in museum lectures, it's hard to represent visually the kind of grinding poverty of many people there. But court records and documents certainly record that. And it is actually pathetic how many people may do or didn't, and courts were filled with hardship cases like that. The architectural evidence is fast disappearing, I suppose, but in East London you do find that, and towards the north as well, as the city expanded into those fields after mid-18th century. There are some very good books, one of which I put on the handout list, Jerry White, is famous for having scoured documents and court records for, it's from him that I learned so much about prostitution. You might wonder, who knew? But other trades, pastimes, and professions are very well documented there and well grounded in documentary references. So that's not a very eloquent reply, but it's a big city. There were a lot of poor people. There's plenty of evidence of grinding poverty and rather pathetic lives, but not a lot of architectural evidence survives.
Well, thank you very much for speaking
you.
today, and thank you for coming.